What is up, everybody? RLTK podcast. Jordan here, chilling with my boy Chris. As usual, Chris, what is good, homie?
What's up, bro? How you doing, man?
Doing pretty good this morning. I got my coffee. Can't
There we
complain.
go. There we go. Well, I'm not doing too good this morning, man. You know why?
Why?
Because my Cowboys ain't doing too good, dog. And I know it's
Bro,
preseason, bro. I know it's
yeah,
preseason, but still.
I'm just kind of like acting like it's not happening right now. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah. Yep.
nothing's going on, but we low key are 0-2. I mean,
Mm,
the
yeah.
last game was a little bit better than the one before, I think, but still, I'm kind of like, and I'm low key kind of nervous about Dak this year. So, hey,
Yes.
listeners, community, put that on your prayer list, please. Cowboys, pray Dak doesn't get injured. We know you
Come
probably
on,
don't like
man.
the Cowboys, but do it for us. Do it because you love us, please.
Come on, man. Come on.
Thank you very much.
But I ain't gonna lie though. I think this is the year of proving yourself. I think because
Bro, he has to do it. If he doesn't do it, it's
yeah,
over.
he
It's
has
over.
to.
Has
Yep.
to.
It is
Has
what
to.
it is. Yes,
Has
sir.
to. Well, I'm really excited about today's conversation. Haha, pun intended.
Yes, I know,
Because we're
right?
going to be talking about conversation. And I
Mm,
think why this is important for us to talk about is that this is like central to our ethos as an organization with Reframe, the for-profit company. As you guys may or may not know, we create youth ministry content and resources. ReframeYouth.com is where you would go to check those out. We create them from the urban context. That's where we're from. We create them to reach kids in that context. But I think what we see in our world is that the urban context is now becoming like more of a global thing because we're talking about the culture itself, and that culture is being pushed through social media, through technology. And so now a lot of kids are engaging in the same things. And so I would say ultimately the things that we're creating, they are like urban and we're unapologetic about that. But at the same time, those things very much apply to the suburban and rural context too, to some degree. And so check those things out. But conversation, we believe that conversation is like central to how you engage this next generation, and ultimately like conversation is central to life, right? For multiple reasons. And so excited to dive into this topic of conversation today and kind of explore that and kind of explain that to you guys from our perspective. So Chris, let's dive into it, man. What's the first question on the ballot today?
Well, I think like the first question is it's a simple question, but yet it's an interesting question. Is what is a conversation? Uh, I like it. It strikes me sometimes to even think about what we're doing right now. It's like it's so much meaning in the idea of what is conversation. The
Yeah,
ability
absolutely.
to choose words, to how to communicate, to connect. It's like in the sense of it's an intimate tool, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
The ability to communicate your feelings, the ability to communicate your thoughts, to express, your offenses, to express what you think is true, and I think to really dive into what is a conversation is something I want to dive into. I think very early on is what is it?
Yeah, that's good, man. I think when I think about that question, the first thing that comes to mind is the importance of listening. I think about I took this spiritual formation class in school, and we read a few books, like one of them, like the spirituality of listening, and like just how difficult it is to actually listen to somebody.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and I think a lot of people engage in conversation with people that like really actually isn't conversation because you're really not listening. You get what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like you're listening to respond, or like you've got something in your mind that you want to say. So you're really just waiting for them to be quiet so you can say it, right? And I think the reason why this is important is because in particular with reaching young people, if they know you're not listening, then they're not listening either, right? And so I think one of the really important things that we have to do is like intently listen to the things that somebody has to say, and not just listen to respond, but listen to feel, listen to understand, listen to empathize, listen to experience compassion I know I'm getting a little therapeutic and psychological here.
No,
And I think
yeah.
I think there's a point where
All
that
right.
starts and that ends, right? Like I think you can go too
Mhm.
far with that. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
don't get me wrong. But I think all that is an important piece of like dialoguing with another human being. Is like actually hearing, feeling what they have to say, experiencing what they have to say, and then like
Mhm.
responding genuinely out of what they just said. You get what I'm saying? And
Yep.
so
Mhm.
I think sometimes in the context of conversation, we kind of miss the importance of that, because I think
Mhm.
there's like conversation is not just something that two people do, but it's something that they experience. And
Mhm.
like there's this potential to grow, to be challenged, to learn new things, to understand new things in the
Mhm.
context of like every conversation we have. And then to get
Mhm.
theological with it, like there's also this opportunity to experience God in the context of every conversation too.
Yes.
Because, you know, as a Christian
Good.
or even not, like really just keep it a stack, like how does somebody even come to faith? You know what I'm saying? Like there's this
Mhm.
dialogue happening between them and a person who is sharing the faith or asking difficult questions that they may need to take time to process. And then in the
Mhm.
midst of that, like God, the Holy Spirit is at work, revealing
Mhm.
things to that individual and perhaps revealing things to the person that is also like trying to communicate the gospel to that person. And so I think God is very much an active participant in the context of conversation too. And that's
Yes.
something that we shouldn't miss
Yeah.
also.
Yeah. I like that. It's good. I think even as I'm listening to you talk, it reminds me of just this tool of interpretation. I think
Mm,
in order to listen, right, you have to have the ability to interpret, right? Because not only are you listening to what they are saying, you're trying to interpret using that tool, interpretation, to understand what they're saying, and so and then you get to communicate back. So is this what you're actually saying? Is this what you actually mean? Right. And
mm,
this shows them that you are listening, right? And
mm,
so I think to even talk about the idea of interpreting is very vital when we talk about a conversation, right? Because from what I understand, to interpret something is to understand its meaning, right? To
mm.
grasp the concept of an idea, right? Or an emotion, right? And so when we even when it comes to the idea of God revealing truth, God revealing himself, he's doing that in the tool of interpretation. He's helping you understand who he is and how he
That's good.
works and what he is doing. And so the human mind is fascinating, by the way, because this idea of like we also have this thing called imagination, right? I
Mm,
don't know where it's at in the mind per se, but imagination is an important feature in the mind that helps us grasp the photo that you're trying to paint for me, to help me understand
that's good.
how you see the world, right? And so all that is a part of listening to people,
Hmm.
and I think this also sometimes why we get offended, sometimes because how we interpret what we think you're saying, how we
Correct.
imagine what you're saying, it's offensive sometimes. Like, how dare you
Hmm.
say that the Cowboys are trash when I know they're going to win a Super Bowl this year? But that
Amen.
may now
Amen, brother.
that may now that may be some delusion there, right? It may
Mm.
be, and that's interesting as well, right? Like the fact that we have the ability to deceive ourselves, in the midst of imagination, in the midst of interpretation, we can tell ourselves certain things that is or is not true. And so, I
Yep.
mean, not to go on a long tangent, but I think this is very vital because this is like the bedrock of understanding what matters,
Mm.
understanding meaning itself
Mm.
is the form of choosing the correct words, phrasing it in a sentence, telling somebody, and them hearing it, interpreting it, imagining it, and receiving it, digesting it, trying to really grasp what's really going on. So it's conversation. I know we use it a lot, but if we really try to understand what is conversation, I think it's more profound than we think I think it's more profound than we think it is. It's truly a blessing.
It's a
It's
gift.
truly It's a
It's a
gift,
gift.
man, because understand that, I'm a very big advocate of preserving words and protecting words and having clear definitions of things, because
Hmm.
all of this has to, how do I say it? Meaning is like a pencil. I mean, our words is like a pencil, right? It draws out the picture. It draws out meaning itself. And if we don't know how to properly talk to each other, I think we're going to miss a lot of things that are important. And so I agree with everything you're saying, man. It's listening is so vital, because you got to know what to listen for, and you got to know what to look for,
Absolutely.
And
Yep.
so,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think about what you were saying. Like there's a concept in therapy called reflective listening. So the idea is
Mm,
somebody says something and then you reflect it back to them to make sure you're understanding it correctly. And what that
mm,
does is give somebody the opportunity to further clarify or to say, no, you didn't understand what I was saying, but maybe
mm,
they didn't communicate it well, because that's possible too. And then they
yeah.
gets communicated again with further clarification, right? And
Mm,
so I think that's an important part of the process of conversation. But I think
yeah.
the thing that's important about conversation is that, like, and I think, like, in a sense, like, this proves the reality of, like, God existing, is that, like,
Mm,
words do actually have meaning, right? Like,
yeah.
it's not like this subjective thing. Like, there is actually intent of the person communicating to communicate something specific to the person that is listening, and we
Mm,
can actually understand that. We can actually
yeah.
comprehend that, right? Which
Right.
I think is a bash to relativity. You know what I'm saying? Because, like,
Mm,
if everything really was relative, then
mm,
could we actually really understand each other? I don't
right.
think so,
Mm,
because we'd all just get to make up our
mm,
definitions of what words were,
yep.
based on how we feel in the moment. No one actually lives that
Mm,
way, right? Like, there are actually, like,
right.
there is, like, authoritative intent. Like, I'm talking right now, and those that are listening are actually understanding what I'm saying, because there is
Mm-hmm.
actually a specific meaning to specific things, because there is
Mm,
actually a specific meaning to all things tell us, right?
mm,
And so, like, that, I think that in itself speaks to a designer, speaks to, like, God actually, like, putting things into motion and having an intent for the things that he created. And like, we
mm,
capture that intent because we're image bearers made in the image of God, right?
mm,
And so I think that's important. But I think, like, to tie all this into Gen Z, like, and to tie all this into Gen A too, I think we need to
mm.
start talking about those guys because they're up and coming,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Um, these guys um, do not care about things the same way we did. Their world is very much not centered around pipeline, authoritative, institutional ways of doing things. It's very social. It's
Mm,
very centered around, like, group, and not necessarily in how they necessarily operate, but most certainly in terms of how they, like, uh, communicate and receive
mm,
information. And
yeah.
so, like, they want to have conversations about truth, not be told what the truth is, right? And so,
Mm,
because of that, like, I think, like, conversation becomes even more important in terms of how we engage young people, how we share the gospel, how we share truths, how we
mm,
engage culturally relevant issues. That's why we're so passionate about the conversational approach to ministry and ultimately to life, man. Like, the
mm,
conversational approach to life, because the way that our world is shaped and ordered now, like, people don't respond to, like, authoritative communication the same
mm,
way they did previously. And that
yeah.
that doesn't mean that we throw authoritative communication out the window. I still think there are moments for it, but I think
Mm,
how we place it in the context of engaging somebody becomes very important. Have we gained their
mm,
trust? Have we given them an opportunity to communicate what they think and feel? Have we
mm,
made them feel like that this isn't just us trying to tell them what is right, but we're presenting them with something that they have to decide what they must do with it, right? I
mm,
found in those types of situations where you do that with young people, they respond so much better. And that happens in the context of a conversation, right? Like, I think
mm,
about this kid that I was having a
mm,
conversation with at high school a couple years ago, and he was gonna, like, get into a relationship with this with a girl, right?
mhm,
And like, one of the major issues in his life at that point was, like, pornography. Like, that was something that he was wrestling with, trying to, like,
mm,
deal with. He knew that, like, that wasn't, like, it wasn't helpful to him as a Christian. It wasn't helpful to him as a human being, right? Like, the data is, like,
mm.
clear, it's there.
Yeah.
And so he's like, yo, I'm gonna get into a relationship with this girl. She doesn't have a dad. She has, like, issues. She's a little bit clingy with me. And I'm like, cool. Well, and, like, if you guys had conversations about, like, once again, conversations, if you guys had conversations
Mhm,
about what you're going to do when, perhaps you want to engage sexually, but you shouldn't. And he's like, nah, I'll just figure it out. And I'm like, well, aren't you kind of setting yourself up for failure there? Like you're almost like
Mm,
leaving the door open for
mm,
something to happen. And if that's what you want, like I can't do anything to stop that. But
yeah.
like the reality, and I said like, hey man, like if you're gonna do that, that's on you. Like in that sense, like I can't stop you. You know what's right. You know what's wrong here. You just have to
Mm,
understand that you're gonna be held accountable for it. Like
yeah.
ultimately, that decision's fully on you, bro. So
Yeah.
if you like decide to like do this, understand this is the path you're walking yourself down, and this is more than likely what's going to end up happening based on like who you are, because I actually know you, and like
Mm,
who this other person is too. And it was really
mm,
interesting to see his face because you could see that he felt the weight of the decision that he was making,
mm,
right? And I don't think he'd have felt that if I'd have just came to him and said, "Yo, bro, that's wrong. Here's all the Bible verses on why that's wrong." Like, I'm gonna go tell her right now to make sure that, um, you know, you do the right thing. You know what I'm
mm.
saying?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
instead, I like had this conversation with him and like helped him feel the weight of the decision that he was making. And guess what he did? Made a different
Mm,
decision. Do you get what
yeah.
I'm saying?
Good.
And so
Yeah.
I think that
Good.
like that can happen in the context of conversation, in ways that like it can't when it's just like this um direct communication that's just like do this, like almost like do this or else. And once again,
Hmm.
I'm not saying like there isn't a place for that type of communication, and like there
Yeah.
isn't a place more specifically for preaching, because there absolutely is, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but I think we just have to be cognizant of how we're communicating things to a generation that like doesn't want to be preached at, um,
Mm,
has a bunch of questions, wants to be heard,
mm,
wants to feel loved and connected to the communities that they're a part of and the experiences that they're having. Like, I think we have to like be aware of those things and then ask ourselves, how do we like pull those things in and be cognizant of those things as we communicate the gospel to them? Because once again, like the gospel in itself is a stumbling block, right? We
yeah.
don't need to be a stumbling block too. Like God is not
Yeah.
calling us to be a stumbling block plus the
Yeah.
gospel. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
the gospel will do what it does by itself.
Mm,
Like
yep.
we should do our best to remove ourselves as a stumbling block
That's
and do
good.
everything we can to communicate clearly what
Mm,
the gospel is in a way that young people can understand it in their context. And that's
yeah.
what it actually means to lead too. Like
Mm,
why call ourselves leaders if we're not willing to do the work of meeting these young people where they're at? Why do we
yeah.
expect them to meet us where we're at? That doesn't make any sense to me. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then if we
Hmm.
want them to like tell us stuff, if we want them to open up about what's going on in their lives, then to some degree we have to demonstrate that. Now, once
Yeah.
again, I'm not saying like tell them everything that's going on in your marriage or tell them everything that's wrong in your life. But like the reality is you can't share that like you're having a bad day. You can't share that like, one of your kids is sick. You can share that like,
Mm,
you know, you're not feeling you've got some anxieties or some fears or concerns. Like once again, all you're doing is saying like, hey, I'm human. I'm following Jesus too. And what that
mm,
helps them understand is like, yo, my leader is not perfect, but like they're following this Jesus dude, and maybe I can do that too.
mm. That's good. I'm glad you brought that up because I mean, out of everybody who that doesn't have to be humble is Jesus, right? But he took on the form of humility for our sake. And I think as that is interesting to me, which is actually the next question is where does humility come in all this
Mm,
when it comes to the idea of conversation, right? Because I like the story that you told with the
mm,
having a conversation with the young man. Um, it seems as though when he felt that weight, he also felt this reverence of what he came to like the revelation or the epiphany or what he's learned, like this reverence of, oh snap, I do need to change my mind, I do need to do something a little bit different. It's
mm-hmm.
almost in a sense of humility inside of him, right? And so, like, what do you think humility plays a part in having conversations with, you know, Gen Z or just with anybody?
Yeah, I think there has to be humility in the sense that we have to seek to understand, right? So we have to seek to understand where the other person is at, what's going on
mm,
with them, clarifying like whether we like truly actually understand. Um, and then I think to some degree, like not put ourselves in a position that we shouldn't put ourselves in. You know what I'm saying? Like once again,
mm,
making ourselves that stumbling block. That the gospel be the stumbling block by itself. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
And so I think like humility also says like there's this reality that like I don't know everything going into this conversation either.
yeah,
Um, I think one of the hardest things to do as a leader, especially in our world today, like in the West, where you feel that pressure to like know all the answers, to have your life together perfectly, to not have anything that you're wrestling with or struggling with, right? Like hiding all those things and then pretending like you have the answers. Like these young people know that you don't have all the answers, bro. You know what
mm,
I'm saying?
yeah,
Like it just smacks of inauthenticity, right? And it like what it does is it costs you trust with them, right? And
mm,
so which like is an essential currency in like the conversation marketplace, and ultimately getting yourself to the point where you have enough trust to actually communicate the gospel and then listen to you, right? And actually
mm,
like hear the words that you have to say and like take them seriously based upon their trust in you,
mm,
right? And now obviously
mm,
we know once again God the Holy Spirit can do whatever he wants. And so like there are times where they don't know that person and they hear the gospel and they respond to it. We're just
yeah,
talking about like basically to some degree the things that we have influence over, right? And like
yeah,
the level of trust that we have with young people would be one of them. And
mm,
so yeah, I think like exercising humility that way. So no, like if you don't know something, just say you don't know.
yeah,
I don't know. Let's figure it out together. Or I don't know. Let me get back to you on that one. Or man,
mm,
that's a good question. I never thought about that before. Let me go
yeah,
away and think about that and I'll get back to you.
mm,
Instead of feeling
yeah,
like you have to come up with an answer in the moment. You don't. You know what I mean?
yeah,
If you have an answer, cool. Like, sweet. Praise God. If you don't, it's cool too. You know what I mean?
mm,
And I think that comes
yeah,
down to also like this sense of urgency we feel about converting people, like
mm,
getting them to the point where they like make this profession of faith or say the sinner's prayer or something of that nature. Like and like them being converted now and like, okay, we're good. You know what I'm saying?
mm,
Instead of this like process that they're going through. And like God. And like I'm not saying like there isn't this conversion moment. Seems like there is one like somewhere. I mean, I had one, you know what I mean? And
yeah,
so there just seemed to be this moment where you pass from death to life. But like when that happens and how that happens, I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
I don't
No, I
have any
feel you.
control over that.
Yeah,
And so I think like sometimes we get like wrapped up in things that like have more to do with God than they do with us. You know what I'm saying?
mm, yeah,
And like we instead of playing our part, which is like this ongoing dialogue, answering these questions, bringing up questions,
yeah,
listening, uh, building trust with that person, being humble in situations where like it requires us to be humble. You know what I'm saying? Hey, I
yeah,
don't know. And so
yeah,
yeah, that's what I think about when I think about humility.
yeah. I like that because I think what I think the reward for humility, the reward for being humble, I think is connection, right? I
Mm,
think that is the part
that's
where
good.
I think that's the part that we miss when it comes to having conversation is that we lack connection, right? I think John Maxwell wrote a book, Everyone Communicates but Few Connects, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, and we see that in society, right? We see that when we're watching these debates or when um, we're on YouTube watching these interviewers interviewing people in the streets, or when we're watching these podcasts, or when people are at each other's necks arguing about whatever topic they're talking about, is that they
Mm-hmm.
lack connection, right? They
Mm,
don't know how to connect with each other, right? Because I think we're so bound up in our own ideas. You know, we're so caught up in our own minds, thinking that we're right, thinking that we're correct, because we're bought into this idea that we can create our own meaning, and you cannot step over that. Like it's.
mm.
I think we're so self centered that we
Yeah,
have
we
no
are, bro.
room.
We
You
are.
know, we have no room to connect with one another, and I think that's the point of humility, is to connect. I think it was Bishop Barron. He said humility is the greatest virtue, and I think
Mm,
humility is the reason why humility is the greatest virtue is because it creates a level of reverence recognizing the unknown, recognizing that I don't know everything. Like you were saying, I don't know everything. I don't have the answer. And I'm okay with that within myself, right? It's humbling to know that you don't know it all, but it's also exciting to know that you don't know it all.
Yep.
Because a part of being a human is to enjoy mystery and
Mm.
to use the tools of imagination to know what is right and what is wrong and to
That's
have
so true,
dialogue
bro.
with someone else. You know what I'm saying? And so I
So
think
true.
that because we lack connection, man, and I know it's hard to connect because one, the main tool of connection is vulnerability. And that's one
Mm.
thing that we don't want to do, because
Uh-oh.
vulnerability is a risk. It's risk,
Facts.
and I can testify to that all day. You know what I'm saying? And
Yes, you
so,
can. Letting you in on a little inside joke here.
yeah, yes. And so, it's hard to be vulnerable, man, because it's a risk.
Mm-hmm. It
It's a
is.
risk, and
It is.
it's, but it also, with that risk comes the ability for that other person to invest in you, right? And
Mm.
also for you to invest in them. And
Yep.
so that's why it's a full circle, right? Humility, connection, vulnerability, which is it's a cycle. And I think if we can understand that with each other, we can, which is a practice, a discipline. I think we have the better chances of communicating, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the best way to communicate is to um, learn how to connect. And I think if we can do that, I think we'll do very well with connection. So my next question for you is, do you think people are having a hard time connecting with Gen Z? Do you think that's a
Absolutely.
difficult thing? Okay. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the generational gap is massive. The chasm is larger than it has ever been before.
Mm,
And I think part of the reason for that is like the technological advancement. Like, when have we ever been at a place in human history? And maybe we have before. I'm sure we probably have, but I can't think of one
mm,
where there's something that the young people know better than the older people. Like,
mm,
usually the things that like drive a society forward are passed down from the parents to the children, right? With
yeah.
technology, with
Yep.
the advancement of the phone and the advancement of the smartphone and tablets and all those different types of things, our
Mm,
kids understand those technologies better than we do.
yeah.
And they like, that's the way that their world works, right? It's the way that they
Mm,
communicate and interact with each other. You know what I
mm,
mean? Like, it's
yep.
through screens now, it's through technology, it's through social media. And obviously, like, there are pros to that, and there are some real clear cons to that,
That's
right?
good. Yes.
And so
Yes.
but the issue is that creates a larger chasm of disconnection between older and younger people. I mean, there always is one, right? Like, I think what's really interesting is like engaging with teenagers, especially families engaging with teenagers. Usually parents are going through a midlife crisis, and the kid is going through a crisis because they're going through the fastest period of change that they experience in the context of their life, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why like raising teenagers is so difficult. It's not just that they're teenagers, it's also that you're probably having a midlife crisis, which is fascinating, right? So
mm,
like the two, arguably some of the most difficult times in a human being's life, uh like come together in that space. And now we have this technological gap which makes the chasm even larger. So now like we're struggling even more to figure out how to communicate with one another, because right, the
mm,
reality is too, like, talking is not the only form of communication, right?
yes.
And so like we can communicate through text message, we can communicate through um FaceTime, we can communicate through um blogs and articles and YouTube videos. Like, so when we send things to each other, those are communications, right? Like, if
Mm-hmm.
I send a video to one of our interns, or if I send them a blog or an article, I'm communicating something to them. I'm like, hey, this
Yes.
idea is of value, it's worth you taking your time to
Mm,
look at, or hey, what do you think about this? So there are all these different methods of communication. When I'm in relationship with them, we're in person, like, communication is heavily nonverbal, right? Like, us
mm-hmm.
talking is a part of it, but body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, like all of those things play a part in what communication actually is. And so like
Mm.
all of this stuff's become more complex, and then like we misunderstand each other even like more and more. And then like you've got the generational gap in terms of like actual words that we speak in language. Like they just
Yeah.
like they have a whole different way of talking that is like completely different to ours. And then like, you know,
Mm.
memes is a whole method of communication for them. And then
Yeah.
like they have this like weird way of like telling jokes, which is they tell the most nonsensical jokes ever. And those
Yeah.
are funny, right? Like the
Yeah.
more it doesn't make sense, the funnier it is. And to
Right.
me, I'm just like, that's weird. But to them,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, this is great, right? But that kind
Yeah.
of plays into their morbidity. It plays into like the way
Mm.
that they like basically see to some degree the world as meaningless.
Yeah.
And like so like we need to understand those things about them and engage those things as we're having
Mm.
dialogue and conversation with them. And so
Yeah.
I think that like the challenge for us as pastors, parents, teachers, coaches, mental health professionals, like whatever, is to like actually study the culture of Gen Z and
Mm.
understand like who they are, what they're about, and Gen A too, because they're coming up now as well, right? Who they
Yeah.
are, what they're about, what they believe, what their values are, how technology has shaped them, how they communicate with one another. Like all of those things are going to be beneficial in terms of how you communicate with them. Like I've had so many
Mm.
conversations, like in the mental health world and just in like the church world too, have been like with parents, like, hey, like you know, if you want to communicate an idea with your kid, it's going to be way more beneficial if you send them a YouTube video than if you or an Instagram
Mm.
post than if you just go like to their room and talk at them. And
Yeah.
then you just see it click on in their mind. They're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
that's why they send me stuff all the time." I'm like, "Yeah, they're trying to
Yeah.
communicate ideas to you. They're trying to
Yeah.
communicate like, "Hey, this person said this thing and I believe this," or "What do you think about this?" Like it's because this is their method of communication, right?
Yeah.
And so like we've got to understand those things about them. Now, what that means in the context of like youth ministry, in the context of like sitting kids down and communicating the gospel to them, like some of those things are going to be beneficial as well. Like what if
Mm.
you had conversations with young people at your youth group, and then like you sent them a couple YouTube videos to watch that week? Probably
Yeah.
going to watch them, probably going to check them out, you know, at
Yeah.
least a couple minutes, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then say,
Yep.
hey, if you want to send me some stuff back, send me some stuff back. Like,
Yep.
and that's how that's also a way that you could be communicating with them throughout the week, even though like, you know, you only get this 1 or 2 hours with them each week. It's a way of you extending your influence, right? You could be
Mm.
sending things to them that they could be watching and then sending things back to you and continuing this dialogue. And then they
Yeah.
come to this central space where you guys are having conversations about things that they care about and
Mm.
then sharing the gospel in that context, which is the other
Yeah.
thing, right? Like if we
Yeah.
want to communicate the gospel to them or anything for that matter,
Mm.
uh, we've got to share it in a way that's relevant to them. Like we're pretty individualized. They're hyper individualized, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like if it's not relevant to them at all, they're
Yeah.
tuning it out, bro. You know what I'm
Yep.
saying?
Yep.
Which makes it even more challenging. I mean, we tune stuff out if it's not relevant to us, but if it's not hyper relevant to them, like
Mm.
I ain't got time for it, bro. I'm on my
Yeah.
phone, I'm
Yeah.
texting somebody, I'm like talking to the person next to me or whatever. Like I'm already checked out. I'm donezo's. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yep.
And so like all of those things become really important in terms of communication, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think, um, especially when it comes um, to how you live. I think, especially with when it comes to my engagement with Gen Z, it's really about how I live. Really, I think there's a an old country saying is that the best sermons are lived and not preached. And
Mm,
I think that, sometimes the best way of communicating with Gen Z is your life, right? It's it's how you discipline yourself, how you make decisions, um, how uh, um, how you spend your money, or what neighborhood you live in, the music you listen to, like all these things Gen Z pays attention to, right? Like, because they can sniff out fakeness,
hmm
and so it's interesting to me because we want to be able to communicate to Gen Z. We want to be able to help Gen Z. We want to mentor and lead Gen Z and serve Gen Z. But, like you talked about, no, our culture is not the same. It's different. And, when we was in high school and we was in college, right? It was about finding a mentor. Me and you both had mentors, and we was
Mm-hmm.
sitting at their feet and learning from them. They was giving us books to read, and we was investing in what they was invested in. I remember when I was in college, I had a mentor named Mr. Don. Shout out Mr. Don. He was one of my favorite mentors, man. He took me out into the country and he allowed me to help him build his house. And as we was building his house, he was teaching me things. In the sense of like I was listening to him, and I just took what he said and was like, man, that's good. Keep feeding me more. But with Gen Z, it's not like that. The culture they live in today, it's more about like what the world is telling Gen Z is that you can create your own truth. You can create your own meaning. And so it makes sense when they don't want to hear anything you have to say. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that goes into accordance with what you were saying, how they're hyper individualized, because the world has now put the ability to create meaning and truth in their hands for themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
so it helps them. Well, it doesn't help them, but it forces them to work out what they think is true and meaningful for them, because the world says, hey, this is okay. You know what I'm saying? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that is interesting within itself. And I think that plays a part in why Gen Z doesn't want to listen to any of us, or, they don't want to sit down and be told what to do, is because the world is telling them you can create your own meaning and truth. And so now we have put this in their hands, and now they're hyper focused on themselves, right? Individualized, expressing themselves as individuals, things of that nature. And I think that's also why they're having like an identity crisis,
Yeah.
because in creating your own truth and meaning, you have to create your own identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because where else are you going to have this truth and meaning come from if you don't even know who you are? You understand what I'm saying? And so
Correct.
if you don't have this sense of self, then there is no sense of truth and there is no sense of meaning. And so now
Mm-hmm.
we have this this massive crisis of there is no meaning in life. Now, here is where the conversation comes in, okay? Because understand that they're somewhat correct. They're somewhat correct. Did I say that correctly? Yeah. They're somewhat correct in the sense of this life is perceived to have no meaning.
Mm.
All the chaos that's going on. When you look on your phone, there's always some disaster. There's always some crazy stuff going on in the streets, like, or it's always something going on. And so it's like, man, what is the point of all these things? What's really going on?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
to a degree, they are right. It is perceived to me that there is no meaning in life. Well, you're correct to a degree, but meaning does exist. It's our job to find it with the aid of God, right? What scripture says, it's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of man to search it out. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's like,
It's good.
meaning exists. It's here. It's alive. It's around you. And I think that's where, to the degree that Jordan Peterson talks about, hey, making cleaning up your room, taking on responsibility is a way of finding meaning in life.
Mm-hmm.
Through the hardships and struggles is where you will find purpose. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying? And so I think that this is where conversation for us comes into play. Learning how
Absolutely.
to communicate to Gen Z, not just with our words, but with our actions, because they have a heart for justice. They have a heart for, doing things that are right. They have a heart for nonprofits. They have a heart for small businesses. They don't really have a big joy for big corporations, things like that, but they have a heart for small business owners. They have a heart for, just authentic things.
Yep.
So that in itself is meaning, you
Mm-hmm.
know. But see, the reason why conversation is important, because words help shape what you feel inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying? It helps
Absolutely.
shape that. And this is why it's important to to know how to connect and to know how to communicate and how to phrase a sentence in a way that is capturing, to the Gen Z, and help them to see that there is purpose in what you're feeling in your heart. And so, like,
That's good.
You know, you understand what I'm saying? And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and I think this is why also the scripture talks about life and death is in the power of the tongue. You know, like the fool speaks destruction, but the tongue of the wise speaks life. It's like a waterfall. You know, it's like water. You can drink it. It's life. It gives you energy. It gives you the ability to move. It gives it's meaning. You know, it
Mm-hmm.
gives you meaning. It's life, and
Mm.
that's why it's so important. I think that's why the scripture really hones on to the like it points to the mouth, to the tongue. Be careful what you speak. And I think this is also why God's going to hold judgment to everything that we say, you know,
That's
because we
good.
have the ability to affect people's psyche. We have the ability to affect their
Mm.
emotions. You know,
Mm.
we have that ability to do that, you know,
Yep.
and that's
That's good.
very, you know, it's dangerous. And so it's very important that we have an encouraging tongue. It's very
That's good.
important that we think before we speak, that we're prudent with what we
Mm.
what with our words. But this is also, and I know I'm going on a tangent here, but it's so much, because this is why we have to have a variety of language. This is why our, you know, our language has to be broadened, you know, and so we can be able to find things that are capturing, because there are words that bring death and there are words that bring life.
That's a good
You know what
point.
I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is why it's important to help when it comes to Gen Z and communicating and help them to
Yep.
see that meaning exists,
Yep.
is to be excellent. Excellent. Do your best to be excellent in articulating yourself, and be
That's good, bro.
excellent in your
It's really good.
studying, and be excellent in observing, to be excellent in critical thinking, to be excellent in meditating and understanding what's in here, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because Gen Z needs your wisdom.
Yes,
They
they do.
need it. They need it. That is the truth. You cannot dispute that. It's We should know by now that it is impossible to create your own truth. It's darn near you can't do it. It's like, in order to create truth for yourself, you have to take things from the world. You have to take things from the world to create your
Mm.
own idea of what you think is true. And so if
Mm.
that is true, then what is better, to go out into the world and take this dirt and this grass to create meaning for yourself? Or is it better to heed the wisdom of the wise and say, hey, I've done this, I've tried this, it didn't work, here's what I find to be true?
It's good.
And so this is why it's important for Gen Z. But it's like you said earlier, we have to understand their culture. We have to understand their language, which is the next question, by the way, about communication and conversation, is language. Now, Gen Z's language is not like ours, right?
Mm.
How they communicate is not the same how we communicate. So I would ask you, how important do you think language is? And what part do you, well, let's say that. How important do you think language is?
Yeah, it's good, bro. There's so much stuff that you said. I gotta backtrack for a second because
Yeah,
I'm thinking
fair. Yeah,
about
yeah.
what you said. When it comes to mentorship, bro, like I think Gen Z does care about mentorship, but from a different perspective. Like I think for us,
Mm,
it was about um
mm,
being people who listen to our mentors. I think for them, they want to be known by their mentors. And I
mm,
think that the importance for them in that is that like they live in a world where it's hard to be known because like
mm.
everything feels like a competition through the social and technological space.
Yeah.
And so there's this need to be known. But also what we know through psychology is that this reality that in order for identity to be understood, it's actually spoken into you by other individuals. So like, for example, we get our sense of identity, who we are, how we communicate, like what language we speak, the things
Mm,
that we understand, how we're shaped, how we view certain things, all that stuff comes from our family of origin, right? Like I
yeah.
learned to communicate because my parents communicated with me, and then my brain, being malleable, learned how to communicate, right? Learned
Mm-hmm.
how to talk back to them. And that language was English because I lived in the UK. Your language was English because you lived in America, in the West, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so that's really important to understand. Like identity is like spoken into us. Identity is
Mm,
communicated to us by the things that are said to us. And also like, so like people communicating to us our uniqueness, our worth, our value. Like that comes in the context of our family, context and friendships, the
Yep.
context of like the places that we hang out, right? So like youth ministry is one of those spaces.
Mm.
And so that's really important for us to understand. So like that's a piece where conversation becomes really important, right? Because young people
Mhm.
are looking for identity. They're looking to figure
Yeah.
out who they are and what their life's supposed to be about. And we have this opportunity to speak that into them. And from a theological perspective, communicate to them they have a Father in heaven who wants to speak that into them because he's the one who actually created them and knows their identity
Mm.
better than anybody else, right? And so
Yes.
I think that's
Mm.
really important in the context
Yeah.
of conversation. And that's why
Yeah.
conversation becomes so essential, which also speaks
Mm.
to one of your other points, which was like, that's why what we say really matters,
Yes.
really matters.
Yes.
Like there are, there are times where like I've said stuff to people in passing and then years later they come back and say like, yo, that like changed my life. And I'm like,
Mm.
I wasn't even really paying attention,
Yeah. Mm.
which like to some degree is like in itself a warning. Like, yo, pay attention to the words that you speak. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like you could like
Yes. Mm.
impact the trajectory of somebody's life or how they think about
It's true.
things with the things that you say, especially if
Yeah.
they trust you, right? Especially if they
Yes.
value like what it is that you have to say. And hopefully
Yeah.
if you're a parent, pastor, teacher, coach out there listening, like you have young people who value what you have to say around you. So that becomes like really important in terms of
Yeah.
how you communicate with them and like how you understand language's ability to communicate identity, like
Mm.
in the conversational space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really important. But
Yes.
to your question of like language, what do you mean when you say language? Clarify that for me.
Yeah. 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 So I think, just how things sound to us. I think language is interesting because the simple fact that we can, and I not mean I not mean language in the sense of um like English, Spanish, Mandarin. I mean like language in the sense of phrasing a sentence. How we're able to put words together that creates a level of meaning that affects us mentally and emotionally. Like, because, all right, the reason why I say words matter, and I've already said it before, how I speak, how I talk, it matters, um, because there's no other way that we can understand what matters.
Mm,
There's no other way. Like, if we didn't have language, how can we understand meaning and how can we understand what matters? Now, again, the moral law, the law of God is written on our hearts. It's not like we don't have some type of sense of what matters, but
mm,
how we speak clarifies what we
that's
already
good.
know inside,
That's good.
right? And so the reason, so when maybe I should have chose a different word, right? Even now, I'm struggling with trying to find that correct sentence or that correct word so it can match what I'm trying to say in my mind. So even now is an example of that, because this thing in us, this moral law of the sense of good and evil, what's right and what's wrong. We don't need, to a degree, we don't need people to tell us because we already have that sense inside
Mm-hmm.
of what's really important. But this is why free speech matters. This is why listening and having conversations and talking matters, is because at the end of the day, to have better understanding of what meaning is, not just for the individual but for society. Because I also think there is a such thing as societal meaning, because whoever you are leaks into society. And so um if we don't have this better choice of language and choosing words correctly, I don't think we'll be able to even understand how to even live in this life. I mean, what is the
Mm-hmm.
gospel? The
Mm-hmm.
gospel is is God communicating to us that we cannot rescue ourselves and we need a savior.
Yep.
That is what the gospel is communicating to us. Is there is no way in your human strength, your human ability, your human mind that you can straighten out what is crooked. There's nothing you can do. And it helps you understand that you are far from the truth.
Mm,
And the whole point of Christ is to come and reconcile. That's why I believe that one of the things reasoning is restoring. Okay. It
mm,
is to restore back to what is right and what is good.
mm,
We're, like Solomon said that man was made upright, but we gave ourselves to many schemes. Like God made us
mm.
to be good, but we fell far from that,
Yep.
and so what is another way that we can get back to that? It's what the gospel is communicating. It's communicating that no one on this earth can reach God except God coming to us so we can reach him. The communication of the gospel. It's restoring us back to the creator, restoring us back to what we was, this idea of uprightness, whatever that means. We're
Mm.
being restored that back. So when I say language, I'm just simply trying to say what is the best ways for us to communicate with each other,
That's
so we
good.
can be able to grasp what really matters, which a part we already know, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I
I know I
think
said, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think I would point back to like some of the things that we've already suggested in terms of like the language that we should use. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
like you said, how we say things, how we communicate things. And I think part of those are like developing developing the skills that you need to like do certain things that you need to do, and
Mm-hmm.
communicate things in ways that you need to communicate them. Um, but I think there should be this care and compassion and love and concern in the way that we communicate the things that we communicate to young people. Um, I think humility, once again, like you mentioned, humility is like a massive part of that. Um, Vulnerability, connection. I think if we like communicate the things that we communicate with those things in mind, it's almost like a values framework for how we use language, if that makes sense. And I think
Mm-hmm.
if we have like a values framework for how we use language, it'll inform the way that we craft our sentences. It'll inform the way that we ask questions. It'll inform the way that we approach young people, even, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's ways that we can say things, the ways that we can communicate things that really um, get at the heart of what a young person is looking for, a Gen Z or a student, a Gen Alpha is looking for. Um, like I could ask you a question, right? In two different ways.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
hey Chris, did you take out the trash, bro? Chris, did you take out the trash?
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying? And obviously
Yeah.
I'm just like, that's like a
No,
super
yeah.
basic way of communicating. But
No,
like
yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of how I'm posing the question, right? How
Mm.
my voice was inflected and all those different types of things um affects the way that you're gonna experience that what I just said and respond to it, right?
Yeah.
And once again, I think one of the most important things that I've learned is like sometimes young people come at you that way, right? Like they come at you all
Mm.
aggressive, or they come at you condescending, or they come at you like
Yeah.
disrespecting you.
True.
And
Mm-hmm.
what I found is that oftentimes when people do that, it's actually not about me, it's about them.
Yeah.
Something going on in them that made them respond that way. And if I can get curious about what's going on in them, that like communicates to them like, dang, this person really cares about me, because I just like was
Mm.
kind of out of pocket, and they totally moved past that because they were concerned for what's going on in me to make me feel like I needed to respond that way. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? And I
Mm-hmm.
think like that can move us a step closer to that vulnerability, that connection,
Mm.
that you were talking about earlier, right? So that we can have that deeper conversation and get pointed towards the truth that is the gospel in the context of conversation. And once again,
Yeah.
that's why conversation becomes so important, because um like that can't happen in certain settings, right?
Mm.
But it
Yeah.
can happen in the conversational setting.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think that's why we do what we do at Reframe. I think because we've been on campuses for several years now, and not even just that, we also started on the college campuses, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to having conversations about, what the culture is going through, what the culture is thinking through. I can remember us being on the college campuses, inviting people to have conversations,
Yep.
to talk, you know, um, to best understand how to live in this world, and to express each other's pains and worries and concerns.
Mm.
We've literally have done this for about a decade and a half. Literally.
Yep.
Like literally we have I'm just now this just now thinking
Just
about it. It's like
reflecting on it.
literally, yeah, man, like we've done this for a
Yeah.
decade and a half. Is that our profession is talking. And we have, grown in that. And especially the things that we have heard that people have told us in private. And you know, the times when you sit with someone in private and they express something so profound to you and they're sitting there in tears
Mm.
and you have no words to say. You have nothing to say. We've all been
Mm.
there.
Mm.
And it's that moment, like that Job moment where the person is in such despair that only thing you can really do is just shave your head, sit there and mourn
That's
with
good,
them.
bro. That's good.
And that in itself is communication. That
Correct.
in itself
Correct.
is a form of love and care and compassion,
Bro, that's
you
good.
know. And so sometimes this is when talking about language, sometimes you're not going to have the language.
Yep.
Sometimes you're not going to have the
Yep.
words because
Yep.
the
Yep.
human ability to communicate is limited. Just like everything
Correct.
else has a limit,
Mm.
words have a limit itself because
Mm.
we cannot fully express emotion and we cannot fully express thought. So that's why we have music, art, painting, things of that nature that express something more profound than words can ever do. When
Yep.
you sit and watch a movie like the Beautiful Mind, something that is painted so beautiful that
Mm.
words cannot capture that. Words cannot explain what you've seen. You know what I'm
That's
saying?
good.
And so like when you watch a movie called Remember the Titans, something like that what the picture it paints of that historical time, words cannot display that. And so
That's good.
sometimes you're not going to have words, but and like I said before, that saying, sometimes the best sermons are lived and not preached. When someone is going through something hard and you don't have words, the best way to communicate is just to be there. Like, bro, I
Correct.
don't know what to say, but
That's
I'm gonna
good.
sit here with you. I'm gonna mourn with you. If you don't eat, I won't eat. If you're
Mm.
hungry, I'll feed you. If you're thirsty, I'll give you something to drink. And bro, I don't have the answer, but I'll sit here with you. And that's another way of communicating that, you know, hey, I love you, basically. There
Yeah,
is love here,
absolutely.
you know?
Absolutely. I think that's a great place to land the plane.
Mm,
Um, and it's probably the last thing that we need to talk about is
okay.
this idea of presence,
Mm,
right? We're talking about
okay.
presence.
Yep.
And so, like you're saying, like sometimes I don't have the words,
Yeah.
but I can be present with this person,
Mm,
right? I can
yep.
be present with this young person. I can sit with them as they wrestle through whatever it is that they're wrestling through. I don't know the answer. I don't
Yep.
know the answer to the problem of evil. I don't know why this
Mm,
happened in your life. I don't know why that person did that. I don't know why your parents aren't here. I don't know
mm,
why your dad died. I don't know why your mom lost her job. I don't know,
yeah.
but I'm here, right?
Yep.
And I
Yep.
think ultimately what that speaks to is like how I believe Jesus like deals with the problem of evil. He
Mm,
enters into it, right? Like
that's
you were
good.
talking about, like God,
Yeah.
Christ becomes a man, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so what God does is he enters into our world, suffers with us, and dies for us. right? And
Yep.
so now,
Yep.
like, suffering and negative experiences in this life and things that we don't understand haven't gone away. But what we do know is that, one, we don't go through those things by ourselves. And two,
Yes.
like, God in his goodness somehow gives those things meaning,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know if there's anything worse than suffering and it being feeling meaningless. I don't know if there's a
Right.
worse place to be than that.
Yeah.
And so God is present with us, and we
Mm.
can be present with others, bro.
Yep.
And if all else fails, if your ability to communicate fails, if your ability to ask questions fails, if
Mm.
you don't have answers, just be present, man.
Yep.
And that in itself is a powerful tool. Once again, that builds trust.
Yep.
That you're entering into that vulnerable, deep, dark, hard space with a young person um, could be incredibly important to them, because once again, they see through you that Jesus is present with them as they experience suffering, and Jesus suffered on their behalf, right?
Mm. Yeah. It's true.
Yeah, bro. Okay. Well, I think this is a good place to put the pen in it for now, but
Yeah.
I feel like we ain't done.
Yeah, I think it will never be done, but I would say, man, if no, we have come in this space, man, to try to communicate something ourselves and to hop in these conversational spaces, man. So, like and subscribe and share this video with anybody, and leave a comment down below. Talk to us, communicate with us.
Yeah,
What are
for
your
sure.
thoughts on having conversations? What are your struggles with having conversations with Gen Z or a loved one? Conversation is like, again, it's vital in society.
That's good.
Because we all want to understand what matters.
Mm,
We
yep,
all want to understand what is really meaningful in this life. So
that's good.
we
Like
appreciate
we
y'all for
always say.
watching, man.
Like we always say, it's the beginning of the conversation, not the end, right? So
Yes,
yeah,
sir.
questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the bottom, leave them in the chat.
Yes, sir.
Some of you guys know where to get at us. Shoot us a text, phone call, email, whatever. We
Mhm.
want to dialogue. We love you guys, and we'll talk to you soon. Peace.
Peace.